When the Bureau of Investigation agents, the precursors to the FBI, breached the front door of the Moretti mansion in 1937, they weren't prepared. They expected gunfire. They expected blood-soaked carpets and the brutal arithmetic of a gangland slaying. What they found was silence. They found dust. They found the entire Moretti crime family, or what was left of them, seated around the grand mahogany dining table. Don Bastiano the Bull Moretti, his son and heir Leo, and 3 of his most loyal capos. They were not shot. They were not stabbed. They were mummified. Their hands were folded in their laps, their eye sockets hollow, their mouths open in a silent, collective gasp. They had, by all medical accounts, simply starved to death in their own home, surrounded by untouched crates of food, wine, and canned goods. In the center of the table, untouched by the thick shroud of dust, sat a single perfectly preserved black rose. This scene was the final, terrifying act of a ghost story. The file was opened, and a name was entered: Isabella Romano, aged 22. And then, almost immediately, the file was closed, sealed, and buried so deep it would not be spoken of again for 80 years. Because what the agents would uncover was not a simple tale of murder, but a story of psychological unraveling so complete, so methodical, and so utterly evil that to acknowledge it was to acknowledge a power they could not fight. How did a 22-year-old Mafia bride, a woman dismissed as a porcelain ornament, convince an entire family of killers to sit down, lock their own doors, and simply wait to die? To understand how a fortress built on bullets and blood was brought down by a whisper, we must go back 3 years to the cold Chicago winter of 1934 and the day Isabella Romano first arrived. Her arrival at Chicago's Union Station was a portrait of calculated modesty. 1934. The tail end of the Great Depression. The air smelled of coal smoke and the iron-gray chill rolling off Lake Michigan. Isabella Romano stepped off the train from New York, a small, dark figure against the cavernous, steam-filled station. She was not beautiful in the way of a movie star. Her beauty was of a different, more unsettling nature. It was the beauty of a porcelain doll, flawless and utterly unreadable. She wore a simple black wool coat, her face partially obscured by a modest veil. Waiting for her on the platform were not flowers but men, hard men in long coats, their hats pulled low. They didn't part the crowd, they displaced it. At their center stood Bastiano the Bull Moretti. He was a man built of pig iron and paranoia, the undisputed boss of his particular slice of the Chicago outfit. This marriage was a transaction, a political merger between his family and a powerful Sicilian network back east. He was acquiring a connection, and his son Leo was acquiring a wife. He looked at Isabella not as a daughter-in-law, but as livestock. He assessed her hips, her teeth, her hands. He grunted, a sound like gravel settling. "She's small," he said to his consigliere, not even bothering to lower his voice. Isabella, just 22 years old, merely inclined her head. "Don Moretti," she said, her voice a soft, cultured whisper with only a faint trace of Sicily. "It is an honor." He grabbed her elbow, his grip like a butcher's clamp, and steered her out into the city. The Moretti compound was a fortress, a looming grey-stone mansion that swallowed the light on its block. Inside, it was a museum of bad taste and fear. Heavy velvet curtains, dark oil paintings of saints and sinners, and the constant oppressive smell of cigar smoke, stale whiskey and fried onions. Here she met her husband-to-be, Leo. He was a weak-chinned, handsome man with his father's temper, but none of his strength. His eyes were restless, constantly darting, already hollowed out by gambling and opium. And finally she met Leo's sister, Sophia, a pale, devout girl who seemed to haunt the house's hallways like a ghost. Sophia, unlike the others, truly saw Isabella. She saw the way Isabella's eyes tracked every man in the room, the way she registered the exits, the hierarchy, the subtle flinch when a capo's hand went too quickly for his pocket. That night at her first family dinner, Isabella sat silent, eating almost nothing, a perfect portrait of demure obedience. Bastiano held court, his voice a roar, his men laughing too loudly at his jokes. He had forgotten her already. She was just a piece of furniture, a decoration. But Sophia, watching from the far end of the table, felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Isabella was a lamb brought to the slaughterhouse. The bull, however, had made a fatal mistake. He had forgotten that a lamb can be a disguise for a serpent. Isabella's power did not begin with a knife or a gun. It began in the shadows of the household. She spent her first weeks in the Moretti mansion not as a bride, but as a servant of her own design. She woke before the maids and went to bed after the last soldier had left the Don's study. She was a ghost in plain sight. She would be found in the kitchens, her pale, delicate hands shelling peas alongside the staff, her head bowed. She listened. She learned that the cook's son was in trouble with a loan shark. She learned that Don Bastiano's personal driver, a man named Sal, secretly despised him for a past insult. Most importantly, she learned from the elderly maid, Maria, who had been in the house for 30 years. From Maria, she learned the house's true religion, Don Bastiano's crippling, all-consuming superstition. He wasn't just a Catholic. He was a man ruled by omens, by the malocchio, the evil eye. He would not sit in a certain chair, would not begin a meeting if a black cat was seen that day, and paid a local strega, a fortune teller, a monthly stipend to keep his aura clean. Isabella filed this away. She was a collector of these small, mundane sins. She learned that Leo, her new husband, was not just gambling. He was losing catastrophic amounts to a rival family, the Falcones, and was stealing from his own father to cover the margins. She learned that two of Bastiano's top capos, Knuckles Gino and Whispers Petey, hated each other with a murderous passion, an internal rot that Bastiano ignored. She was building an arsenal, not of weapons, but of wounds. She became the house's confessor. The staff, so used to being invisible or abused, mistook her silence for sympathy. She would offer a kind word, a small stolen bit of food from the pantry, a glance of shared suffering. The cook, weeping over her son, found a small anonymous envelope of cash tucked into her apron pocket days later. Sal, the driver, found his wife suddenly hired for a prestigious job in a downtown department store, a store Isabella had visited just once. She wasn't buying loyalty. She was purchasing leverage. She owned them body and soul, before the family even knew she had a name. She was weaving a web of whispered obligations, a network of spies that ran on gratitude and fear right under the bull's nose. The family saw a mouse. They failed to see the spider. The first test of her nascent power came 6 weeks into her marriage. Knuckles, Gino, was a man of brute force, a relic of the old bootlegging days who saw violence as the solution to every problem. He mistrusted this pale, quiet bride from the East. He saw her as a bad omen, a potential spy. At a Sunday dinner, drunk on bootleg whiskey, he made his move. He backhanded a maid for spilling a drop of wine, then turned to Isabella, his eyes red-rimmed and challenging. "In Sicily," he slurred, "women know their place. They don't listen when men talk. They stay in the kitchen or the bedroom." The table went silent. Bastiano watched, a flicker of amusement in his eyes, waiting to see how the doll would react. Leo looked down at his plate. Isabella didn't flinch. She simply met Gino's gaze and said softly, "You are right, Gino. A woman's place is to protect her family, sometimes even from itself." The ambiguity hung in the air, thick and toxic. Gino, too drunk to understand the threat, just laughed and turned back to his meal. Bastiano, disappointed by the lack of fireworks, moved the conversation on. But Isabella had not been speaking to Gino. She had been speaking to the room. A week later, Knuckles Gino disappeared. It wasn't a dramatic hit. He just failed to come home. 2 days after that, his car was pulled from the Chicago River, riddled with bullets. Bastiano was furious, assuming it was the rival Falcone family, a declaration of war. He ordered his men to tear the city apart, looking for the assassin. He never found one. The Falcones, in fact, sent a wreath, genuinely confused. Sophia, however, knew the truth. She had seen Isabella 2 days before Gino's disappearance, meeting a woman in the alley behind the mansion. It was Gino's wife, a haggard, beaten woman who had endured his abuse for 2 decades. Sophia watched from her bedroom window as Isabella, in the freezing cold, spoke to the wife. She didn't threaten her. She didn't order her. She consoled her. She held her hand. And then she gave her a small velvet pouch. Sophia couldn't hear the words, but she saw the transaction. Isabella hadn't ordered a hit. She hadn't involved a single Moretti soldier. She had simply given a desperate woman the proof of Gino's mistress, his hidden bank account, and the name of a man who owed Isabella's family back east a blood debt, who could solve the problem permanently. Isabella had weaponized a battered wife. She had used the family's own shadow network against itself, and the bull was now chasing ghosts, weakening his own position, all while the real killer sat across the dinner table from him, quietly eating her soup. With Gino removed, a power vacuum opened. The natural successor was Whisper's Petey, but Isabella had other plans. Her next target was the true pillar of the Moretti empire, Silvio, the family's elderly consigliere. Silvio was not a killer. He was the brain. He was loyal, meticulous, and had served Bastiano's father. He was the one man Bastiano trusted implicitly. He was to Isabella the most dangerous man in Chicago, because he was the only one smart enough to see what she was doing. She couldn't poison him. She couldn't intimidate him. She had to discredit him. She had to use Bastiano's own paranoia against his most loyal servant. For weeks, she used her network, the maids, the drivers, the kitchen staff, to plant whispers. Not accusations, but questions. Why does Silvio meet with the banker on Tuesdays when the Don only meets on Fridays? Did you see the new car Silvio's son is driving? Must be doing well. These were small, seemingly innocent observations, seeds of doubt planted in the fertile soil of Bastiano's suspicious mind. Simultaneously, Isabella began her masterpiece. She used her husband Leo's access to the Don's study. Late at night, she would help Leo with the books, a dutiful wife trying to understand her husband's business. In reality, she was studying Silvio's immaculate accounting. She wasn't looking for flaws, she was looking for patterns. She found one, a complex system of contingency funds that Silvio used to hedge against busts and raids, a brilliant piece of wartime accounting. To an outside eye, it could look like skimming. Isabella created a second ledger, a forgery, perfect in every detail, that mirrored Silvio's system but subtly inflated the contingency numbers, with tiny, almost untraceable lines of credit moving to an account she had created under a false name. She then arranged for this false ledger to be discovered by Whisper's Petey. The one man she knew would relish the chance to bring down his old rival. Petey, smelling blood and a promotion, took the ledger straight to Bastiano. The bull, already primed by weeks of whispers, exploded. He saw not a safety net, but betrayal. The confrontation was not a trial, it was an execution. Bastiano summoned Silvio to his study, the false ledger open on his desk. Whispers. Petey stood in the corner, a smirk playing on his lips. Bastiano, his face purple with rage, shoved the book at his consigliere. 30 years, he roared. And this is how you repay me? Stealing from my children's mouths? Silvio, a man of profound old-world honor, was stunned. He looked at the ledger, then at Bastiano's face. He recognized the forgery, recognized the setup. He knew instantly who was behind it. His eyes flickered for a moment, searching the shadows of the room as if he could see Isabella hiding there. He could have explained. He could have shown Bastiano the real books, proven the forgery. But to Silvio, the accusation itself was the true betrayal. To be forced to defend his loyalty to a man he had served his entire life was an indignity he would not suffer. He drew himself up to his full height and said, "Bastiano, if after 30 years you believe this, then there is nothing I can say." This, in the brutal, simplistic world of the bull, was an admission of guilt, arrogance. He backhanded Silvio, a crack of bone on bone that echoed through the house. "Get out!" he spat. "You are finished." Silvio, his face bleeding, simply turned and walked out of the mansion, never looking back. With one move, Isabella had decapitated the Moretti brain. The family was now blind. Whispers. Petey was promoted to consigliere, a man of pure muscle and ambition, utterly incapable of strategic thought. And into this vacuum stepped Isabella. That very night she came to Bastiano, her eyes wide with concern. "Papa," she whispered, "I am so sorry. Silvio was like an uncle, but I worry about the books. Leo, he is not well." She offered in her quiet, helpful way to organize the finances, to protect the family from any other traitors. Bastiano, his paranoia now at a fever pitch, his most trusted advisor gone, agreed. He handed her the keys to the kingdom. Within 48 hours, Isabella Romano, the 22-year-old bride, had her hands on every dollar, every contract, every payoff, and every secret ledger in the Moretti empire. She now knew where every body was buried, because she was the one drawing the maps. Her next move was to secure her own position by neutralizing the heir. Her husband Leo was not a threat, but he was an inconvenience. His presence as the future Don blocked her own, and his weakness made the family vulnerable. Killing him would be artless. It would invite questions from the commission back east. No, Leo didn't need to be murdered. He needed to be hollowed out. He was already a man of prolific vices, a gambler and a dabbler in the opium dens of Chinatown. Isabella simply became his enabler. She encouraged his business trips to the far side of town. When he stumbled home at 4 in the morning, reeking of dope and cheap perfume, she wasn't the angry, judgmental wife. She was the understanding confidant. She drew him a bath. She listened to his slurred, paranoid fantasies about his father's disapproval. "He doesn't respect you, Leo," she would murmur, dabbing his forehead with a cool cloth. "He still sees you as a boy. You should be the one making decisions." She fed his resentment, watered his addictions. When his gambling debts to the Falcone family became too large to hide, he came to her, terrified his father would kill him. Isabella solved it. She paid the debt in full, but she didn't use Moretti money. She used her own, the money she was now expertly skimming from the family's contingency funds. The Falcones were paid, but the debt was merely transferred. Leo no longer owed a rival, he owed her. This new debt was not one of money, but of servitude. She owned his secrets, his addiction, his very survival. She began to use him as her puppet. She would suggest ideas to him in his opium haze, ideas for the family business. "Leo, darling, perhaps we should route the Canadian whiskey through the transport union, not the fish market. It's safer." Leo, desperate for a good idea to present to his father, would take it as his own. He would present the plan to Bastiano, who, impressed by his son's sudden insight, and with whispers Petey too foolish to see the flaw, would approve it. The plan, of course, was designed by Isabella to fail in a very specific way. It would fail just enough to cost the Falcones a shipment, further angering them, while a small, untraceable portion of the lost cargo was routed to Isabella's own network. She was simultaneously making her husband look competent, weakening his rivals, and building her own shadow empire, all while turning Leo into a hollow-eyed, trembling addict who couldn't make a decision without her approval. He was the Don-in-waiting, and she held his strings. By mid-1935, the Chicago outfit was in chaos, and the city's other families could smell the blood in the water. Bastiano Moretti, once a figure of calculating brutality, was now erratic, paranoid, and making disastrous decisions. His new consigliere, Whispers Petey, was a hammer in a world requiring a scalpel. The Moretti family was bleeding money, territory, and respect. And into this chaos stepped a new player, Agent Frank Thorne of the Bureau of Investigation. Thorne was a new breed of G-man, a college-educated, incorruptible agent who believed in ledgers and tax law, not back-alley informants. He had been part of the team that finally brought down Capone, and he was now aiming his sights at the collapsing Moretti empire. He saw a wounded animal, and he was moving in for the kill. Thorne started digging. He set up surveillance on the Moretti mansion. He began auditing the family's known front businesses, the laundries, the olive oil import companies, the social clubs. He expected to find the usual sloppy bookkeeping, the clear lines of graft and extortion. Instead, he found nothing. The books were immaculate, perfect, too perfect. Every I was dotted, every T was crossed. The money flowed in and out with the pristine logic of a legitimate corporation. Thorne was baffled. This wasn't how the outfit operated. He pressed his informants, squeezed the low-level street thugs. But he met a new kind of wall. His best informants, men who had been on his payroll for years, suddenly went silent. One was found hanging in his own apartment, a supposed suicide. Another simply vanished, his wife and children disappearing overnight. A third recanted his testimony, his eyes wide with a new, profound terror that Thorne had never seen before. Someone was cleaning his network, cutting his lines of information with surgical precision. This wasn't the bull's clumsy, violent work. This was something else. This was sophisticated. This was invisible. Thorne felt a cold dread. He was hunting a wounded bear, but he had the distinct feeling he was being stalked by a panther. Agent Thorne, frustrated and stymied, widened his net. He abandoned the financial trail and began investigating the social connections of the Moretti family. He assumed the rot was coming from inside the outfit, but all his leads were dead. He decided to look at the periphery. He began tracking the movements of the women of the family, a detail most agents ignored. He followed Sophia, the sister, and found she did nothing but go to mass and confession, her face a mask of pale terror. He followed the wives of the capos, and then he followed Isabella. He followed her to a charity fundraiser at the Drake Hotel, a glittering affair for the city's elite. He watched from the shadows of the ballroom, expecting her to be a wallflower, an out-of-place mob bride. Instead, he watched, stunned, as she commanded the room. She wasn't holding court with gangsters. She was holding court with the wives of judges, the sisters of police commissioners, and the daughters of city aldermen. She was a picture of grace and empathy, dressed in a demure but exquisitely expensive gown, a small pearl at her throat. Thorne watched as the mayor's wife, a formidable woman, wept on Isabella's shoulder, complaining about her husband's infidelities. Isabella just listened, patted her hand, and whispered something. The woman nodded, dried her tears, and looked at Isabella with something akin to worship. He saw the wife of a circuit court judge, a woman known for her severe demeanor, laugh at something Isabella said, a genuine, girlish laugh. Isabella had done what no Don had ever managed. She hadn't bought the city's elite. She hadn't threatened them. She had befriended them. She had weaponized the women's network, the gossip, the social obligations, the shared secrets of the parlor room. She was the city's confessor. And in exchange for her sympathy and discretion, these powerful women gave her everything. They gave her jury lists. They told her which judges were vulnerable to blackmail, which politicians were taking bribes from other families, and which cops were on whose payroll. And, Thorne realized with a sickening jolt, they told her the names of his informants. Isabella wasn't just a mob bride. She was the most powerful intelligence operative in the city of Chicago. She had corrupted the system from the top down, using the very people Thorne was sworn to protect. The final confrontation came not from the law but from within. Bastiano the Bull Moretti was a stupid man in many ways, but he was an animal of instinct, and his instincts, for months, had been screaming that something was wrong. His empire was crumbling, his rivals were laughing, his son was a ghost and the feds were sniffing at his door, yet he couldn't find the source of the rot. It was Silvio, the exiled consigliere, who provided the final piece. From his forced retirement, Silvio sent a single unsigned note to Bastiano. It contained only 5 words: "The snake is in your house." Bastiano, reading the note, finally understood. The whispers, the missing money, Leo's brilliant ideas, the silence of the feds, the disappearance of Gino. It wasn't the Falcones. It wasn't a traitorous capo. It was her. It was the pale, quiet doll from Sicily. He roared. He summoned his last 2 loyal bodyguards, men who had been with him for 20 years, and stormed through the mansion looking for her. He found her in the conservatory, calmly pruning a black rose bush. "Witch!" he spat, his hand going to the gun under his arm. "You've ruined me." Isabella turned, no fear in her eyes. She simply held the pruning shears. "I have ruined nothing, Papa. I have simply tidied." Bastiano raised his gun. "I'll send you back to hell." But before he could fire, his 2 bodyguards, the men who had served him for 2 decades, stepped in front of him. They didn't draw their weapons on him. They simply blocked his path. "Boss," one of them whispered, his face pale. "Don't." Bastiano stared at them in disbelief. "Move. That's an order." The bodyguard, Sal, the driver whose wife Isabella had helped, shook his head. "We can't let you, Don. It's the Malocchio. It's you. You're cursed." Isabella had done her work too well. Over the past year, she had amplified Bastiano's own superstitions, staging omens for the staff and soldiers to find. A dead crow on his pillow, a broken mirror, salt spilled in a perfect circle. She had used her network to convince the entire household that Bastiano himself was the source of the family's bad luck, that he was cursed, and that she was the only one who could protect them. She was a strega, a holy woman. She looked at the broken Don, his own men standing against him, and she gave her first and last direct order. Lock the doors, all of them. The feds are coming, the Falcones are coming. The house is cursed. No one leaves, no one enters. I am the only one who can keep us safe. The men, driven by a terror deeper than their loyalty to the bull, scrambled to obey. They bolted the heavy oak doors. They shuttered the windows. Bastiano Moretti, the tyrant of Chicago, was a prisoner in his own home. The siege had begun, and from the inside. The great graystone mansion became a tomb. Inside, the world shrank to the smell of dust and stale air. Bastiano, his power utterly broken, was confined to his study, a roaring lion reduced to a whimpering cub. Leo, his opium supply cut off, writhed in withdrawal in his bedroom. The remaining capos and their wives huddled in the parlor, their fear curdling into a toxic paranoia. The only figures who moved freely were Isabella and Sophia. Sophia, the pale sister, was now Isabella's shadow, her wide, terrified eyes a silent witness to the horror. Isabella controlled everything. She controlled the food, the water, the information. On the second day, she announced that Agent Thorne and the feds were surrounding the house, a lie the barricaded family had no way to disprove. On the fourth day, she announced the Falcones had poisoned the city's water supply and that only the bottled water in her personal pantry was safe. She doled it out in meager cups. She was starving them. Not just of food, but of hope. She was the physician and the disease. She would visit each of them, one by one. She sat with Whispers Petey, the brutish capo, and spoke softly of his many sins, the men he'd killed, the families he'd ruined. "Confess," she urged him. "Confess and you will be clean." He wept, and he told her everything. She listened, her face a mask of beatific sympathy. She moved to Leo, her husband, who was now a trembling, incoherent wreck. She held his hand and coaxed out his own pathetic secrets, his betrayals, his thefts, his hidden hatred for his father. He babbled and she recorded. She was compiling a new ledger, not of money but of souls. Sophia, forced to accompany her, sat in the corner, a pen and notebook in her hand, her small, neat script recording every whispered confession. This, she was told, was God's work. This was the only way to lift the curse. The house was suffocating. The air was thick with the stench of fear and unwashed bodies. Days bled into a week, then two. The inhabitants were becoming skeletal. Their minds, starved of food and sanity, began to break. They saw shadows in the hallways, they heard voices. Bastiano, his famous rage long since evaporated, sat in his chair, rocking back and forth, muttering to the ghosts of the men he had killed. Whispers Petey, convinced he was already in hell, would scream for hours, begging Isabella for absolution. Leo just cried silently, clutching a pillow, calling for his mother. Through it all, Isabella moved with a serene, terrifying calm. She ate, but never in front of them. She kept herself and Sophia clean and fed, a living contrast to the decay around them. She had broken them. She had stripped away the thin veneer of their power, their brutality, and shown them the terrified children underneath. She had held up a mirror, and they had shattered. On what they believed was the 20th day, Bastiano, a broken husk of a man, crawled from his study. He fell at Isabella's feet. He grabbed the hem of her dress with a trembling, filthy hand. "Please," he wept. "Mercy. I'll give you everything. Just make it stop." He confessed. He confessed to everything. The first man he killed in 1908. The judge he'd had executed. The network of politicians he owned. The location of every safe house, every hidden account, every secret. He poured out 30 years of sin at her feet. And Sophia, her hand shaking so badly she could barely write, recorded it all. The bull's confession. The final entry in Isabella's ledger of damnation. When he was finished, a hollow, empty shell, Isabella looked down at him, her face devoid of all emotion. "God forgives you, Bastiano," she whispered. "And now, it is time for the final supper." She prepared the feast herself. While Sophia watched, paralyzed, Isabella went into the vast, stocked pantry, the pantry she had told them was empty, and prepared a meal. She brought out cured meats, cheeses, fresh bread she baked herself, and a dozen bottles of the Don's finest wine. The aroma of cooking food, the first in weeks, was a form of psychological torture. She dressed the grand mahogany dining table. She used the best china, the family silver. She lit candles. It was a portrait of civilization in the heart of madness. She gathered the survivors, Bastiano, Leo, and the two remaining capos. They were shadows, their fine suits hanging off them like rags on scarecrows. They stared at the food, their eyes disbelieving. "The curse is lifted," Isabella announced, her voice resonating in the cavernous room. "You have confessed. You are clean. The feds are gone. We are safe. Let us eat." They wept with gratitude. They fell upon the food, their hands shaking, stuffing bread and meat into their mouths, gulping the rich red wine. They praised her. They called her a saint. They thanked God for her. Bastiano raised a glass, his hand trembling so violently he could barely hold it, to Isabella, our savior. They drank, and one by one, they slumped forward. Leo smiled, a single tear rolling down his cheek before his head hit the table. Bastiano simply closed his eyes as if going to sleep. The capos fell where they sat. It wasn't a violent poison. It was a release, a powerful, soporific overdose, a gentle exit from the hell she had built for them. They died at the table, their hands folded, their last meal uneaten. Silence returned to the mansion. Isabella stood at the head of the table, looking at her work. She then went to the conservatory, cut a single perfect black rose, and placed it in the center of the table. She retrieved the ledger of confessions from Sophia's room, tucked it into her coat, and took the trembling catatonic girl by the hand. She walked to the massive front door, unbolted it, and stepped out into the 1935 sunshine, leaving the dead to their eternal dinner. For 2 years, the Moretti mansion sat silent, a brooding stone anomaly on its busy Chicago street. Neighbors assumed the family had fled to Italy, escaping the feds. The house was respected, feared, and avoided, until 1937, when a foreclosure notice finally gave the city a reason to enter. Agent Frank Thorne, now a senior figure in the newly named FBI, was there when the doors were opened. He was the one who found the mummified bodies. He was the one who saw the black rose. The scene haunted him. It was too clean, too symbolic. It was not a murder. It was a statement. But the official investigation was short-lived. Days later, a package arrived at Thorne's office. No return address. Inside was Bastiano's confession, the real ledger. Thorne read it, and the blood drained from his face. It wasn't a list of mob hits. It was a list of his world. It named 2 sitting senators, a half-dozen judges, and, most damningly, one of the highest-ranking men in J. Edgar Hoover's Washington office. Thorne finally understood. Isabella hadn't just killed a family. She had compiled the single most dangerous document in America. The evil that the FBI couldn't file was not the psychological torture. It was the truth. The file was a political bomb. If it ever got out, it wouldn't just destroy the outfit, it would destroy the government's credibility and Thorne's own career. The Isabella Romano file was sealed. The official story became unsolved gangland slaying. The Moretti family was a footnote, and Isabella, she vanished. She and Sophia were never seen again, or almost. Decades later, a historian researching Catholic charities uncovered the private journals of a nun who had worked at a quiet, secluded convent in upstate New York. This nun, Sister Agnes, had entered the convent in 1935. Her old name was Sophia Moretti. Her journals, written in a cramped, fearful hand, never spoke of Chicago. They were filled with prayers and a single repeated phrase, scrawled over and over in the margins of her Bible. She held up the mirror. They died of the reflection. As for Isabella, she melted into history, taking her ledger of secrets with her. She became a ghost, a whisper. But the power she held, the secrets she bought with the souls of the Moretti family, makes one wonder. A 22-year-old girl who could topple an empire and blackmail a government doesn't just retire. She evolves. And it leaves us with one final haunting question. Who did Isabella Romano become, and which modern empires are still paying the price for her silence?